Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Balmain Institute 4th seminar. I am Mo McCarthy, the president of the Balmain Institute. We are quite fortunate tonight to have as our speaker Dr. Brigit Busicchia from Macquarie University, who will be speaking on the issue of food security and the many issues surrounding it. As we learn to live with the coronavirus, it's very clear that we will be unlikely to return to the wine, cheese, speaker events that we had in the Balmain Town Hall. Nevertheless, we remain committed to bringing informed discussion to people in the community with the hope that this will continue to bring informed discussion to all of us. We hope that these webinars provide mental stimulation to all of us and that we at least have a form of being virtually connected. We know you have numerous opportunities to watch many webinars, and so we appreciate very much that you've made the choice to join us tonight. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. The Q&A function on the bottom of your screen will be there for you to type in your answers to Brigit. And we will try to cover these questions at the end of the presentation. You type in your questions and she provides the answers at the end of the talk. If you have any technical difficulties during this talk this evening, just use the yellow raise hand function and someone will come to give you technical help. On behalf of the Balmain Institute, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, traditional owners of the lands in Balmain and Birch Grove. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the traditional owners of the lands of all the audience tonight. These lands were, are, and always will be traditional lands never ceded. May we walk in peace and gently on them. May we support the recognition of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and may we remember that Black Lives Matter. I would now like to ask Damien to introduce our speaker of the evening. Over to you, Damien.
Thank you, Mo. I also acknowledge the traditional owners, both local and throughout Australia, wherever this webinar is being seen and heard. The Lionel Bart musical Oliver opens with the song, "Food, Glorious Food." We as humans are obsessed by food, glorious food. We have told ourselves that we require at least 3 intakes of it each day. We consume it, waste it, prosper from it, and like no other obsession, we have an obesity problem and a starvation problem. Food is survival, food is currency. Where would we be without food? Our food obsession is readily linked to all social, cultural, ethical and moral circumstances. For example, one of our greatest pleasures is dining with friends. One of the positive outcomes of ending the recent lockdown was the resumption of the ability to do that once again. How many of the world's seemingly unsolvable problems are solved by people of goodwill sitting down and discussing their grievances over a pleasant meal? We are assured during the current pandemic that there is no need to panic buy food, amongst other commodities, that we have the luxurious capability in Australia to produce 3 times our daily food needs, and that we are in such a position food-wise that we are able to export the rest. So what is the reason that food dominates our lives in so many ways? Tonight, the Balmain Institute is fortunate to have as our guest speaker Dr. Brigit Busicchia, to discuss and take our questions about glorious food security. Brigit is an associate lecturer in sociology at Macquarie University. She has a PhD for her research on the importance of political and social origins of modern food capitalism to the current debate on food policy. Outside her academic life, she advocates for a fairer redistribution of food resources. Brigit's talk tonight, The Question of Food Security, Household to Global, discusses the issue of food security to show what happens when the established order surrounding our basic food supply is disrupted. Brigit is happy to take questions, and if you have a question for Brigit, click on the chat button at the Q&A button at the bottom left of your screen. Questions with a question mark, please, not statements, and Brigit will attempt to answer as many as she can given time constraints after her talk. It is therefore with the greatest pleasure that on behalf of the Balmain Institute, I introduced Brigit Busicchia and ask you please to make her most welcome.
Thank you, Damien, for this really very, very rich introduction. And you've talked really well about food. So obviously tonight it's all about food, but not food in terms of gastronomy or cooking. It's food and its role in social organization. As Damien was pointing out, food has many dimensions, and I'm going to cover that. I'm going to obviously try to explain why food is in fact a very political topic. Although we do that every day, we do that 3 times a day, most of us do that 3 times a day, and yet we never really consider food as a political object of social organization. So obviously, if I were to ask you what food is about, I'm sure then I will start receiving answers from you that are multi-layered and complex, because food is complex. Some of you would perhaps say that food is about culture, and it is about culture, of course. Cuisine, for instance, it's a sort of code, it's a little book that tells us what we eat, us, compared to them, the others. It gives you rules, what is taboo, what is not taboo. So food has a very strong cultural dimension. But food is also about nature. Like if we think about food and the production of food, obviously then we start considering its impact or implications on the environmental circumstances. So food can be also treated as nature. So it's culture, it's nature. And it's also about food is also about the economy. In a capitalist society, obviously, and food being a commodity, it's about the economy as well. So some advocates, not some advocates, but people who frame food as primarily an economy. And food is a very big economic sector. In most developed economies, like Australia, the food sector, and when I say food, is from the agriculture to the distribution and its consumption, represents, it's a large source of employment, and it represents a significant part of the GDP. So food is also about the economy. To some people, food is also about ethics. When we think about people who decide to change their food practices to only eat vegetarian diets or vegan diets, it's an expression of ethics. So and obviously food is about nutrition, and it's a very important consideration because it's also about public health. So you can understand that food, with all these dimensions, becomes a contested space where someone would frame food as, for instance, an economic activity, would have perhaps some resistance from people who view food or think of food or want to frame food as an environmental concern. So you can see the tension developing, and we've witnessed that. So tonight, what I thought I would use the concept of food security to show you because most of you, I'm sure, have heard about food security. And I will try to use this concept of food security to show you these tensions and these social, obviously food is so important for our social organization, and yet there is a lot of tension and contestation. So the idea of food security, the concept of food security is going to be the thread for me to tell you a little bit about these political dimensions of food. So I'm going to start sharing my screen because I prepared a little, you see I'm an academic because I prepare little PowerPoints. So let me share my screen with you. And here we are. So this is my, here we are. So I hope you all see my screen, the sharing, and I've got, you have everything? You have the sound and the image? I'm just checking. Mo, everything is okay?
Everything's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about food security? Obviously, it's a sort of implicit meaning, but I wanted to make sure that we all are on the same level here. Obviously, food security has roughly 3 dimensions. One is about the availability of food. Obviously, you can't have security if you don't have the availability of food. So it's about the supply side. And how do we do that? Usually by producing food or importing, trading food. But the production is really at is the essence of the availability of food. Then, obviously, once you have the food, you want your population to have access to it, and the question of access is really about having enough to eat, to have a fulfilling life, and life. Yeah, food then becomes your fuel, and to prosper. And of course, there's this 3rd dimension that is now really bugging us. It's about how we use food and what sort of food do we eat. So it's about obviously the safety of the food we eat, but more so about the nutritional value. And we've, as Damien was mentioning earlier, like there's an emerging, or it's a major problem on the planet to fight like the malnutrition. So basically, food security, 3 dimensions: the supply, the availability, its access, and the use of it and what it is. And food security happens at also different scales because, and it's really the important thing we have to keep in mind for tonight, when we talk about food security at international or global level, we are talking about something very different from when we talk about food security or insecurity at the family or individual level. So I'm going to take you through these 3 different scales, using obviously to show you how these 3 dimensions create tensions. All right, here we go. So if we look at the problem of hunger in the world, and therefore the global project of feeding the world, there are some really interesting figures that we need to remember. One is that at any time since basically since the early 1900s, so basically once the Industrial Revolution was in full swing and we became an industrialized world, no matter what, whether it was in the early 1900s, in the 1950s, or today, there's roughly 800 million people experiencing hunger or undernourishment at any point of time. It's almost like a background noise to this, to the world of these 800 million people suffering from hunger and undernourishment. Sometimes, obviously, in terms of crisis, like we had in 2007 and 2008, the figures jumped to almost 1 billion, and then it gradually came back. I think at the moment it's 826 million people estimated, of course. What is changing is the geography of it. So obviously, in the early days, hunger was found in 3 parts of the world, 3 big regions: Europe, of course, you remember the famines, India and China. Today, China and Europe have, inverted commas, eradicated hunger, but not India. India still carries 280 million people of being undernourished or hungry. So if we were to look at the map of hunger today in the world, primarily hunger is concentrated around the Indo-Pakistani peninsula and the sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the two major areas of hunger. But the flip side of hunger is also malnutrition. It's another pathology. And as we mentioned earlier, roughly 1 billion people will be obese by 2030. So they are really, this is showing that perhaps what we are doing is not good enough. And we perhaps we don't have the solution. So I wanted to show you on the international stage, food security is debated. What are the strategies to address it, and where is the contestation about it? All right. So when they talk about food security at the international level, primarily they're talking about world hunger and how to address that. The agenda that has been put forward, and this is since perhaps the 1970s with the large famines in the sub-Saharan Africa, the idea is to have a form of global governance of food. So the leading protagonists in that, obviously, are the international agencies like the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank. So all these these international agencies are like these coordinating agents to have that global governance of food. Obviously, they do that with the assistance of multinational corporations, because there's obviously lots of business to be done at that level, as well as more and more, and this is very unfortunate, this part of the story, the financial world that is also moving into the agricultural commodity markets. So basically, these actors to solve the problem of food security in the world, they try to say we need a global governance. We have to all partner, we have to create this big partnership around the world. But what does it mean? It involves a lot of market mechanisms, a lot of trade mechanisms, and also when you want to produce more, you need more technology and more intellectual property to develop. And when this sort of technology and intellectual property, really, you can think about the GMO, you can think biotechnology. It's really also that part of that's also another mechanism to help in producing more, supposedly to feed the world, and more land use. So the actors in that scene of international food security are really advocating for more market and trade based, and as well as more technology mechanisms. Obviously, for anything we do and any projects we want to achieve, there are some threats, and one of the threats, or some key threats for this sort of project to produce more to feed the world, is obviously our dependency on oil to produce food, and I'm thinking of fertilizers and pesticides. So we are, if you were to look at the graphs of the food prices on international markets with and its correlation to the oil prices, they swing all together. So there's a very strong association between food prices and oil prices. Obviously, another threat is the natural and ecological limits and the biofuels. So a lot of agricultural commodities are also diverted for the production of fuel. So that is really debatable. It's an area of contestation. And also you need land to produce more to feed the world. And there is a problem with land acquisition and what we call land grabs, where some countries who don't have enough land, they start obviously buying land overseas, usually countries that don't have strong political resistance to that. So I wanted to show you, I've got a map of land acquisition. It's a very informative map, but I'll have to share this with you. Here we are. Can you see it? Yes. So this is a map from an NGO called GRAIN that shows where all the land grabs, so all these entities, these foreign bodies that go and purchase land in Africa. So if you click on, for instance, we are in Australia here. If I click, what do I do? Not here. So in Australia, we can see, for instance, Vietnam has purchased 10,000 hectares for dragon fruit plantations. But then you go, Sweden has also bought a small, so I can send you the link or make it available, but it's a very useful tool to see who is buying where. Obviously, China is buying a lot in Africa, and I can perhaps zoom in to help you to see. Let's say we are in Africa, huh? Let's have a look. Or you want to see? Maybe let's out of curiosity, let's go back into Australia. So China. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen all these different different activities, but you can see Australia is sort of quite in demand. Like there's been all sorts of deals, and these deals have happened over the last 4 years. So it's very enlightening to see that. So we could spend a lot of time, obviously. So we see the sub-Saharan African region to be really the target of land grab. A little bit in yes, in this region. In Europe, it's interesting. So France, it's where I come from. I think it's totally forbidden. They can't allow foreign entities to purchase land. So you can see. But in Russia, there's quite a lot of. Is it Russia? No, it's Eastern Europe here. So yeah, there are ongoing things, and obviously South America here with, for instance, where in Brazil, yeah, the US. This relationship between South America and North America is very, it's not, it does a lot of this. Okay, so that's, but as I said, I can, if you're interested, I can send you the link to this, for this map. So obviously, and the last threat that is really a concern nowadays is the food price volatilities that is created, in fact, by the finance sector moving into the agricultural commodity markets. So they speculate on commodities, and so it sends the price highly. It instills a lot of volatility in food prices. So what does it mean that small and poor countries that have to buy agricultural commodities on global markets are totally exposed to these volatilities, and they can't control the pricing. So it is really a danger. So obviously, food, as I tried perhaps to imply, is highly political, and feeding the world could be seen and is being viewed as a geopolitical project, because you remove you remove access to food, you put a country on its knees. So it has this sort of global governance of food has been run by very powerful countries, usually the developed world. The recipient of these strategies have been the developing economies, and some of these countries have been really stripped of the agricultural sector. For instance, I'm thinking about Mexico. Mexico, the home of corn, of maize, as the Americans call it, and Mexico saw the US dumping subsidized corn on the land of Mexico, pushing away, obviously, the little Mexican farmers who could not compete with cheap subsidized corn from the US. Today, and also they had entered a free trade agreement with the US. Today, Mexico no longer produces corn, which is quite remarkable, and import its corn, all of its corn from the US. So you can understand that it creates resistance and contestation. So the contestation has been in the form, so in South America, but also in Europe and in Indonesia. And in India, there's been an international farmers movement who is trying to really resist this liberal agenda of feeding the world. They really have strongly politicized it. It's called Via Campesina, and I'm going briefly to talk about them. So it's a big farmers movement, around 200 million farmers or peasants who have come together to resist and to put their agenda to the United Nations, with not talking about the idea of food security. They don't want this terminology. They are talking about food sovereignty. In other words, they want to say they want to be access to food is a right. Everybody has a right to produce what they need without being pushed and bullied, obviously, by the developed nations. So, Michelle, if you want to play this, it's a 3-minute video that shows what the Via Campesina is about and how they understand the production of food and food sovereignty. Thank you, Michelle. There's no sound. Michelle?
Consumimos alimentos llenos de pesticidas, químicos, saborizantes, edulcorantes que han incrementado las enfermedades relacionadas con la alimentación. Fertilizantes artificiales y pesticidas que dañan el medio ambiente. Alimentos y materias primas transportadas alrededor del mundo que aumentan la producción. Granjas locales que desaparecen. Mientras aumenta el hambre en el mundo, se desperdician grandes cantidades de alimentos. Y todo este sistema está respaldado por políticas públicas. Así que los vecinos nos hemos juntado para buscar alternativas. Queremos que las personas sean capaces de decidir por sí mismas sobre su alimentación. Esto significa cambiar la forma de producir, distribuir y consumir alimentos. La única alternativa que funciona de momento es la agroecología. Implementando esta solución, seremos capaces de avanzar hacia la soberanía alimentaria. Los alimentos deben ser distribuidos en cadenas más cortas y descentralizadas, promoviendo mercados diversificados basados en la solidaridad y precios justos. Debe acercar a los productores y consumidores en mercados locales de alimentos. Las personas deberían poder desarrollar sus propios sistemas locales de producción y los grandes supermercados y corporaciones deberían tener menos poder. Las instituciones públicas como colegios y hospitales deben ofrecer alimentos saludables y apoyar la producción local sostenible a pequeña escala. Un ejemplo de esto son las cooperativas de consumidores y agricultores. Esto es una sociedad entre productores y comunidades locales donde las responsabilidades, los riesgos y recompensas de la agricultura son compartibles. Todos nos beneficiamos. Los agricultores reciben ingresos estables, seguros y a precios justos de la venta directa de la comunidad y pueden responder a nuestras necesidades. Las leyes y políticas que regulan nuestro sistema alimentario deben ser cambiadas, desde el nivel local a lo nacional, europeo y global. Deben estar basadas en el derecho a la alimentación, el fin de la pobreza y el hambre. Necesitamos leyes que garanticen precios estables y justos para los productores de alimentos. Leyes que deben promocionar una relación amigable entre la agricultura y el medio ambiente. Leyes que deben asegurar la prohibición de la especulación con la alimentación, que no deben dañar la cultura y los sistemas alimentarios locales y regionales, tanto por el dumping como por el acaparamiento. Esto es en lo que yo creo y por lo que estoy trabajando.
So thank you, Michelle. So I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint. So you can see that this movement is really fighting the industrialization of food and really wants to reclaim that right to produce locally, to have short like short circuits. I can't find my words right now. Anyhow, so they are trying to they resist and demand that the industrialization of food be reviewed. The good thing is that the United Nations seems to have heard them. And now more and more, the concept of food sovereignty seems to be talked about by the UN, so and at international level. So there is perhaps a little bit of hope that this resistance and contestation is bearing its fruits. Now, obviously, if there are problems at the international level with food security, at the national level, it also does exist. And as a nation, obviously, any nation aims at sourcing or producing enough food to feed its population, because we know that food shortages will lead to social unrest, and politically, it's not a viable option. So food security, when it's talked about at a national level, usually refers to ideas of self-sufficiency. So in other words, and we hear that from our political or our politicians here in Australia, who keeps telling us that we produce 3 times what we consume, so we are extremely food secure. So it's the idea of that self-sufficiency, that this is also, again, a question of sovereignty. Some countries, most industrialized countries, are self-sufficient, most of them, but some are not, like Britain. Britain is not self-sufficient at all. Britain only has a level of self-sufficiency of 60%, so they need to source at any point of time 40%. So the English are very keen to maintain good trade relations with their partners, because they depend on it, like they sourcing their food. So when a national government talks about food security nationally, so it refers to ideas of self-sufficiency, and obviously to achieve that, it wants to produce in sufficient quantities, and if it cannot, obviously it will call on trade agreements to source the food they need. Obviously, it also to produce in sufficient quantity, particularly with population growing, needs more technology or more land use, so exactly the same dynamics as the international level. The main actors usually at the national level are the governments and the food supply chain. And what we mean by food supply chain is from the producers, like the farmers, to the distributors. So all the chain for which the food is traveling. Obviously, as I said earlier, it's a question of national sovereignty and social order. Like you think about the French Revolution, it was sparked by food shortages. So yeah, it's an imperative for any national government to have sufficient food, to have that social order. Now, I wanted to show you some of these images from this book that was published in 2005, a book edited by Peter Menzel. He went all around the world to document what people ate, and for a week. So he took photographs of the families and the food that was going to be consumed for the coming week. what is interesting I've got few photographs. What is interesting about these photos, you can see, obviously, food, as I said earlier, is about culture, but it's also about the place where you are. And you're going to see, for instance, so this on the left-hand side, it's a photo from Ecuador. Ecuador, obviously, it's the Republic of banana growers, and you can see, so the family eats a lot of bananas, and eats a lot of grain. So it's a really fresh food diet. There's no processed food I can see. So this book was published in 2005. So it's 15 years old. So perhaps now, should we revisit Ecuador, perhaps it would be different. So Ecuador on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it's Denmark. And in Denmark, so we see it's a very developed economy. We see packaged food. We see a lot of bread. I'm not too sure what they eat, the Danes, but there is, on the table, there's a lot of bread and perhaps a lot of, there's some cheese and some cold meat. And let's move to the next one. So on the left-hand side here, we are in Australia. And so interestingly, in Australia, you see a lot of meat. No wonder why, because Australia was set up as one of the meat-producing countries to feed the industrial revolution in Britain. So we eat a lot of meat in Australia, but we also eat a lot of fresh food. You can see there's quite a lot of fresh food, but in the background, the packaged food and the packaged water. So maybe this family lives in a remote area of Australia. Whilst on the right-hand side, we are in the UK, and in the United Kingdom, I think they eat a lot of processed food. There's nothing like on this table that is almost not packaged. And you can even see, even I always I'm a dog lover. I've got a dog myself, and this poor little dog is having also his processed food. Everybody has the processed food. No surprise. Britain being the first nation to industrialize, so has that history of industrialization of everything, including food. So I thought these little images were quite evocative of, we eat obviously what is culturally acceptable, but also the way the national economy has developed also give us shape our food practices and what we eat. So it's very interesting, or to me it is. All right, so when you want to feed a nation, you also face, like at international level, the problems of climate change, of course, ecological limits, land use. And for instance, land use would be is very problematic here, because the farming sector, or the agricultural sector, is in competition with the extraction industries like mining. So we understand that it's a place of contestation and obviously resistance and politics. So the threats to provide sufficient food to the nation obviously is that sort of tension for land use, but also we have external shocks like climatic events, like cyclones, like we had a few years ago, a war, that would be, and recently, obviously, the pandemic that really showed us perhaps the vulnerability of our food supply chain. The interesting part of the story is that obviously our politicians keep telling us that we are food secure because they primarily put the attention on the level of production. But there is another story to national food security, and it's the story of how you distribute this food to the people. And clearly during the pandemic, we have had, when we had empty shelves at the supermarket, it was not, and they were right, we had enough food, but the food was not getting to the supermarket. And so food security is no, although our politicians like to describe it as a question of production, to me, and it's one of the arguments I've made recently, is also about the distribution. And when I say the distribution is to how do you get the food that is produced to the consumer at when they need it. So just to illustrate that political stand that is made again and again, there is a little video we are going to show you about David. It's the Minister of Agriculture, David Littleproud, who is telling the Australian population, is trying to reassure the Australian population during the lockdown measures and during this panic buying that we experienced, that we were all secure and safe. So Michelle, if you want to play this little video of Mr. Littleproud. What a name.
David Littleproud says Australia is a land of plenty.
We as a nation of 25 million people can produce enough food for 75 million.
That's largely thanks to regional Queensland, the food bowl of the nation. But in the wake of panic buying across the country, he's urging consumers to trust the system.
People need to relax. They need to calm down and understand Australian farmers have got them covered.
The latest report by the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Science has confirmed there's no need for alarm.
Real facts is that we are exporting 70% of what we produce, and we will continue to do that.
And he's responded to questions about product limits and bare supermarket shelves since the pandemic began.
Sadly, what supermarkets have to do is actually supply the shelves to 50 million people rather than 25. And that's just put pressure on supply chains that are geared up for 25 million people.
Bevan Beatros owns independent supermarket Beatros Brothers. He says while panic buying saw shortages in dried goods and cleaning products, there was ample fresh food.
There was never any problem with fruit and veggies. There was always plenty of fresh produce.
David Littleproud is urging supermarkets to ensure their prices are fair.
And the ACCC, as the cop on the beat, needs to ensure that they are engaging with supermarkets and monitoring that closely.
Lauren Reddy, 7 News.
Oh, thank you. So here we are. So he's telling us that we should be reassured that we produce a lot of food. He acknowledges, obviously, there's been a problem with the distribution. The supermarket were extremely happy. It was Christmas every day during this period of panic buying. The problem was that the food was there, and it was certain type of pantry items. As the supermarket guy says, like fresh food was never a problem. They had plenty, and people were not rushing to get some fresh food. They were rushing to get pasta and rice and flour. And the problem was that the supermarkets, they source their products from, they have very distinct chains of supplies, and when the demand, like it was the case, surged to that extent, they couldn't meet this demand because they could not source where the food also was. And the food, for instance, in the wholesale sector was there waiting because all the cafes and restaurants had closed down. So there was plenty of food waiting, but it was packaged, like for flour, it was packaged in big bags, or the same for pasta. So the supermarkets couldn't access that. And because they don't want, normally they have contractual arrangement and they have integrated the distribution. So it's what was happening with the supermarkets and our empty shelves. Eventually, everything came back to full functionality, and but I'm sure if tomorrow we were going back into lockdown measures, I'm pretty certain we would experience the same sort of panic buying. I think it was, where was that, in New Zealand? Recently, 2 days ago, I heard that. I'm just going back to my PowerPoint. Here we are. So the question is, there are threats, obviously, to our national food security, and they come from all sorts of directions. We have to be aware of that. And also there is resistance for this agenda to produce more, particularly when it comes to environmental concerns and land use. So in Australia, I'm just concentrating on Australia here. So environmental groups and farmers movements like Lock the Gate are trying to oppose also this constant, they are trying to oppose the mining industry and resist to be able to produce enough food and also to make a living. Now, obviously, it's one thing to have enough food, but as you may remember in this little diagram, the question of access is extremely important. So how do countries ensure that their population have access to this food? And the food security at home is a very important question, of course, but it's talked about very differently. First of all, it's not talked by people from governments usually. It's talked obviously by the not-for-profit sector, like charity organization, like food rescue organization. I'll talk about them later on. So it's talked about also by the public health sector now more and more, because there's a question of malnutrition. And we start to see local government talking about food security at home or food insecurity. Usually we don't talk about food security or household food security. We talk about food insecurity, because you don't talk about people who have access to food. You talk about people who don't have access to food, because this is a problem to resolve. And clearly for food security or food insecurity at home at the individual or household level, it's about economic and physical access. So what I mean by physical access, there are areas in the country and also in other places in the world, like in the US, where there's there's very little food available, and for the population. Usually we call these places food deserts. So in other words, perhaps the only place where you could buy your food is a service station. So you can understand that sourcing or doing your food market at the service station, you're going to be limited in the choice of food. So the agenda obviously this is really a question of social justice, to ensure that everybody has sufficient nutritious food on the table. So how we are solving this problem so far in the developed economies I'm talking about now, the agenda is really to put the food on the table by rescuing the surplus food and diverting this food to the people in need. So that's the major solution that has been thought of and implemented in most developed economies. Now, there are differences between certain countries, like, and usually the differences is how the government involve itself in this sort of solutions. Now, I'm just going to let me put that. So basically in Australia, if we were to concentrate on Australia, these figures, so the Australian government surprisingly does not collect any data on food insecurity in its own country. All the data that we have usually are collected by the not-for-profit sector. So people like organizations like Food Bank or others are the people who are collecting the data about people who are food insecure in Australia. So the latest report on food insecurity from Food Bank says that there are roughly 5 million Australians who have experienced food insecurity in the last 12 months. So food insecurity is not, some people obviously suffer from food insecurity all the time. Some people go through difficult times and they go into food insecurity, come out of it again. But there is the question is really to not have a secure access to food, which is in the 21st century really a question, like it's really a concern. Obviously food poverty is increasing in Australia to a level, like they said, that 22% increase in the number of people seeking food relief in the last 12 months. So this is really a concern, 22% in 1 year. They also, for this year, they have noticed that women are more susceptible or more exposed to food insecurity and food poverty than men. Usually people, the working people are very often people who have access to food rescue, because particularly those workers who are on very small income, and also in precarious situation with their employment situation. So these people who have access to food relief are not only the people from the homeless people, they are really people from all sorts of horizons, people working, single parents, young people. At university, I've just done a research, and most of the university, a quarter of the university students are food insecure and suffer from hunger. So how do we solve that? So far, as I explained earlier on, so we divert surplus food and we divert that to the people in need. So who are the food rescuers? They are private sector. They are obviously not-for-profit organization, but they are all anchored or they stem from the private sector. For instance, Food Bank, which is the largest food relief organization in Australia, is the food industry, because if you were to check their board members, they are all the CEOs of all the large food and grocery companies. And these guys have managed to rescue the food that is not sold, or the surplus food, or things that have been rejected by supermarkets, and bring that into huge distribution centers, from where small agencies and community centers go to source the food. So and basically it's free food. It's roughly I think 50 cents a kilogram, so it's very cheap. So this is a private sector that has organized itself as a charity or not-for-profit to address the question of food poverty in Australia, but also it happens in France, in the UK, everywhere. It's the same sort of model. This usually is something that originally was set up as an emergency food relief, but now it's becoming institutionalized, particularly when some of these food rescues start getting really a very big mediatic profile. I'm thinking like O's Harvest, who've been extremely good at putting themselves in the media, and now we see them as the saviors. And we forget perhaps that the problem of food poverty is structural, and it should be resolved by social policies and not just by emergency food relief. So this, as just to finish on this aspect of food insecurity at the household or individual level, the argument that is often made, and it's the area of contestation obviously, is that food banks or people like O's Harvest they are doing such a great job that they are considered as socially needed, and it becomes an institution rather than just what they were at the beginning, an emergency food relief. And also what is perhaps problematic is to frame food poverty as an issue of charity, when it's the charity sector that caters for that, and not politics. I think this is really something to watch. Now, what are the risks? Obviously, let's imagine that the food supply chain becomes so efficient that one day there's no more wastage. So how we are going to feed the people who need it? So this is a very wobbly model. It works when it works, but there's we don't need much to disturb it, I think. So this is something really to keep in mind, and this is the danger for that food for the food security at at household levels. Now, obviously, some people take their destiny in their hands. They go and grow their own food, and they go to the community garden, and they start to become self-sufficient to a certain extent. Some set up community-supported agriculture initiatives, so where I grow broccolis and we grow strawberries and we exchange. Some also go gleaning or rescue food waste, and a year ago I went with some students at Macquarie. We went dumpster diving, and it was really an eye-opener. It was really an eye-opener. But what you glean or what you rescue from dumpster diving is it sustained a lot of students, or at least the students who have the courage to do that, because you have to be a little bit gutsy, obviously, to dive into these big dumpsters. But what we found, what I was really impressed by what was happening there. So obviously there are ways, but to address food poverty, but by growing your own food, but it's not given to everybody. Nobody has the land to do that, or nobody has access to a community garden. So that was, I hope this talk has been informative to show you that, yeah, it's a complex issue, and depending on what scale, it calls from different solutions. And obviously, because food is so political, it will call for some protestation. And that was my talk for the night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigit. That was extremely informative. It's amazing that the humble food that we eat. Thank you for a most illuminating thing, and at the risk of a pun, it was real food for thought. So we have some very good questions that have accumulated. Unfortunately, we've got to cull them, but I've made what's called a captain's call, what I think are the best to fill out the time we have available. First question comes from Mary. Do you think we should be modifying our expectations of the range of foods we consume to reduce the distances our food has to be carried?
Of course, Mary, we have to do that. We have to only consume what is of season, and we have to change. We've been so spoiled, and it's the difficulty now, is particularly when the media frame food as a question of experience. So to experience food, we have to have these very exotic recipes and access to things that are not in season, most probably not grown in the country where we are. So yes, I totally support that. But it's quite difficult, I must admit, even myself. Sometimes I get a little bit tricked, and I get things that are out of season. But I keep an eye. We are fortunate in Australia, where most of the Australia grows quite a variety of food, and so we have access to strawberries quite most of the time. Obviously, they are grown in glass houses, so it's a sort of different story. But yes, no, it's a very to shorten food miles is really one of the keys to a sustainable future. Definitely.
Thank you. Next one is from Stephen. Does the idea of food sovereignty, quotes, have a place in Australia, or are we too dominated by global agriculture and food manufacturing corporations?
Yes, Stephen, we are, but there is a food sovereignty alliance in Australia. It's a small outfit, obviously, because as it was pointed out in the question, the agricultural sector is highly industrialized in Australia, and also because the Australian farmers don't receive any subsidies. So they have to compete on international markets. So they don't really feel, and obviously they don't really feel or inclined. They are not inclined in limiting their source of revenues. So it does exist in Australia. It's called the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. And there are people who support the movement and the political project, but it's not obviously the majority of the Australian farming community. No.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for that question. And this question's from John. Thank you, John, for your question. With our most recent experience of supply chain being disrupted, do you think there needs to be more intervention by government to ensure supply of key foodstuffs?
That's a good question. Who should do it, the government or the food supply chain, the private actors? Because what's happening now is, my opinion is that the food supply chain is not secure, it's resilient. In other words, if there is a shock like we've had, if we were in a food secure situation, there wouldn't be any empty shelves. We would have enough stock, or the supermarkets would make sure that it would have enough stock to stock and meet the demand, no matter what. Now, resilience is a different concept. It's a concept that says, okay, we can be disrupted, but we go back to full functionality after a period of time. And it's what we are at now, because the food supply chain has to be obviously competitive and streamline every operation. So they do what they call the just on time. So they never freeze capital into unnecessary stock. And it's what also happens. And so the food supply chain withstand the shock. Maybe so we don't have anything, or we don't have the items we needed, and so we go without them, and eventually it will build up again to a sort of full functionality, and it's what they call the resilience of the system, to be able to go back to its functionality. Now, I can't see the Australian government making that sort of calls. Politically, it's not in ideologically, it's not in their view to be interfering with the economic affairs. So I can't see that happening. Now, should they, in the past, and it was before really that sort of neoliberal ideology took off, there were countries and nations were keeping stocks, but no longer. Now there's almost no stock. And it's also a concern. Like if anything happened, I think we have in the world 60 days of food, and that's it in stock. Well, before in the old days, there would have been months. So yes, we are living on the edge. We are living on the edge.
This one from Pam. Our highly centralised food distribution system seems to be very vulnerable to disruption.
Yeah.
Is there a solution, or what is the solution?
I don't know I'm not sure the food distribution system is centralized so much here. I think what I discovered when I did my research is there are two food distribution system in parallel. One is the retail and one is the wholesale, and they don't overlap. So when, like what was happening with the lockdown measures, all of a sudden the retail got that surge in demand. So everybody was rushing at the supermarket to get their grocery items. And these guys, this distribution system couldn't source the products because they would not go to the wholesale distribution system, and they had to they couldn't supply. So I'm not sure if it's we can talk about the centralized way of distributing. I think it's more like two parallel systems that don't overlap. And this is true not only in Australia, it's true all over the developed world. It was the problem of flour was happening in Australia, but it was happening in the UK, it was happening in France, it was happening, I'm sure, in the Netherlands. So it was really, it's the way these modern industrialized food supply chains are designed. And I think it's they are they are extremely integrated.
Thank you. Final question, and then I'll throw back to Mo, is from Martha. Thank you, Martha. Although there is more focus now on affordable housing as a basic right, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about food security as a fundamental right.
That's
Do you agree with that?
It is a very correct and very I totally agree with that. And it's what keeps bugging me, because food, we do it every single day, 3 times a day, and yet we don't seem to see the political, and our politicians, I mean, don't seem to embrace that political dimension of food. And Australia has had, there's something that is a little bit disturbing with the Australian government, and not only this government, but it's been for the last 20 years. Australia doesn't have a national food plan. In other words, there's no national strategy to ensure that food will be made available. There's no plan at all. There was, during the Labour government, there was a little bit of a beep, and then the idea of a project was dropped, and nobody picked it up ever since. So, like, we may have strategies to against cybercrime or against all sorts of things, but food supply, we don't. Food security, we don't. There's not a white paper about food security at a national level. And I think it also stems from the belief from our politicians that perhaps markets will solve it. Market will coordinate that sort of situation. I'm not sure why politically they don't touch it. I'm not sure. It's still a mystery to me.
Yeah. Brigit, thanks so much for honouring us with your presence and your presentation.
Thank
you. The content is just mind-blowing. It's a lot to think about. Thank you, and wish you well in your future research. I'll now hand back to Mo to formally complete the proceedings. Thank you to the questioners also for their excellent questions. Thank you, and good night.
Yes, thank you so much, Brigit. That was a terrific talk. So many interesting concepts to think about, like food sovereignty and food supply. I found it amazingly interesting to realize that there are no food supplies or food stocks. When I was a kid growing up in the US, there was always a move in the summer when the overproduction of things like grain or butter or cheese was always put aside, and then those were used for school lunches or to provide food for people. And this kind of issue of having a neocon approach to food supply, I find quite staggering. Anyway, I want to also thank you very much for making your time available tonight and to share your insights with us. We've learned a great deal, and we thank you very much. Before we close, I would like to thank everyone who's been donating and making a contribution to our webinar. These webinars do incur costs, and we appreciate whatever you can do to help us meet these costs. The bank details are for the Balmain Institute are found at the bottom of the MailChimp announcements. Sorry. It's not an easy time for many of us, and so give if you can, but only if you can. As always, I would like to thank our wonderful technical host, Michelle French, and also Stephen Bristow and Jennifer Spence for all their help and support in making these webinars trouble-free. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sarah Palmer, who is the co-director of the Center for Virus Research at the Westmead Institute for Medical Research and professor of the Faculty of Medicine and Health, the University of Sydney School of Medicine. The topic of her conversation are, where are we with COVID now and how to understand where we are, prospects for COVID-19 in the months ahead. So she will be speaking on the 17th of September. Please join us for another informative evening. Until then, stay safe, wash your hands, maintain your distance, and take care. Thank you.